Welcome to 6 o'clock CNN News. I'm Kara Ocampo, and tonight we are discussing the ever-increasing conflict surrounding the oil industry in the Nigeria Delta region. Joining us tonight is Ben Glickman, a human rights activist who is extremely involved in the situation in the Delta region, and also Rebecca Hazani, a representative from Shell Oil Company. Thank you for joining us here tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you.
Now, can one of you inform me of the origins of this situation?
Sure. It started during the British occupation of Nigeria. The Mineral Oil Ordinance number 17 of 1914 was passed after Nigeria's unification in 1914, and its purpose was to regulate the right to search for, win, and work mineral oils. First, only British oil companies were allowed to apply for licenses under the ordinance, but in 1955, Mobil, which is a U.S. company, was allowed to enter the region.
But after the Nigerians gained independence in 1960, what happened to the oil company's occupation in Nigeria?
Well, after Nigerian independence, the oil companies stayed in Nigeria, and they're still a large contributor to Nigeria's economy. According to a report, which I have here, from 2002 from the World Bank, oil accounts for 90% of Nigeria's export revenue and 41% of its gross domestic product. Also, according to Professor Georg Freines, oil revenue accounts for over 60% of the government's revenue, and the oil industry provides about 96% of Nigeria's dollar receipts. This is why Nigerians have let us oil companies stay in Nigeria, and we do not understand why some people are criticizing us, considering that we hold up Nigeria's entire economy.
Would you like to add anything, Ben?
Yes, much. It is true that oil is a major part of Nigeria's economy, but your reasons for oil companies' continued occupation is a bit sketchy. After Nigeria won independence in 1960, it became very unstable. Political instability was caused by ill preparation, corrupt government, and military coups. The British left the Nigerians with an economy that was over-dependent on oil exports. The Nigerians had no real choice but to allow the oil companies to help produce revenue. Besides, the Nigerian government rigged elections and is corrupted by the oil companies. The oil companies play a major part of the government's revenue, while the military protects them. It is a corrupt system that only benefits the high and mighty. If the Nigerian people were truly represented, the oil companies would be restricted and controlled, maybe even expelled.
Mrs. Ani, how do you respond to these allegations of corruption within the Nigerian government?
The oil companies are not responsible for any corruption between their employees and the Nigerian government. They are constantly accused of funding gangs against other communities, bribery, and killing protesters. I think I can speak for all of the oil companies when I say that this is untrue. We never induced violence. We are only there for our and for Nigeria's economic benefit. In addition, there is no denying that the elections have been rigged in the past, but you cannot blame that solely on the oil companies and on the government, because people from both sides of this argument, including those against the oil companies, have helped to rig elections.
What about the trials and hanging of environmentalist Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni members in November of 1995 for leading protests against exploitation of native lands? Even though Shell claimed it tried to free them, some people still accuse Shell of taking part in the hangings.
Well, like you said, we lobbied to free them, and we never wanted any harm done to them, even though they were protesting our presence.
And the reasons for protesting were just. The oil companies that occupy the Nigerian Delta are the root cause of the horrible pollution in Nigeria. There are oil spills that ruin the water and the land it irrigates, making farming near impossible. They constantly dump industrial waste and do not meet environmental standards.
Ben has made a good point, but now let's move on to our next topic, the Nigerian people. What are the people's reasons for their disapproval with the oil company's occupation? I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, Ben.
Do we have enough time? Fine. With everything I've said before, there's still much to cover. In Nigeria, there's now prostitution, poverty, a high unemployment rate, poor pay, destroyed homes and villages, limitations on the freedom of passage and the freedom of circulation of information, price inflation, poorly funded healthcare by Shell, violence, gangs, theft, rape, irresponsible fathering by expatriate oil workers, the corrupt government, the list goes on. Many of these problems can be found in the Oil for Nothing report from Essential Action on Global Exchange. The people credit much of this to the oil companies, including Shell, and the people have been stripped of all their human rights. Lastly, even though the Nigerian people gained independence in 1960 and their government is ruled by Nigerians, they still feel as if they are ruled by European power to use the Nigerian government as their puppet.
But Ben, you're acting as though the Nigerian people are perfect and completely innocent. I mean, there are so many reports of armed gangs of youth attacking the oil companies, taking the oil, and kidnapping workers. I mean, I have a report here by BBC News. And according to this report, attacks on Shell installations have forced a 10% drop in Nigeria's oil production. I mean, you blame the oil companies and say that we are corrupt when the people of Nigeria do so much to hurt us. When, as I said before, we carry Nigeria's economy.
How can you say
I'm sorry, Ben, but we're running out of time. Both of you made great points, and I can see that this discussion could last for a really long time. But we're going to take a short break, and when we return, we will briefly finish our conversation.
Welcome back to CNN with Kara Ocampo.
And now we're back with Ben Glickman and Rebecca Hazani, who have both debated well on the topic of the oil operations in Nigeria's Delta region. Before we say goodbye to our guests, I have one last question. If you had to propose a solution to the problems surrounding the oil industry, what would it be?
Well, I would say that there should be a closer monitoring of the Nigerian people and the Shell workers. I mean, acts of violence and corruption should definitely be punished. And our oil companies will work harder to bring peace to the region.
And Ben, what do you think?
I believe that the oil companies should be restricted and controlled in their activities by a new Nigerian government. Special elections should be held to elect a new government, and elections should be monitored by UN officials to ensure that the elections are not rigged and that they're meeting their full democratic potential. This will keep the economy rolling, and it will also keep the peace.
All right, that concludes our session for today. Thank you two for joining us here.
Thank you for having us.
No problem.
This is 6 o'clock CNN News. I'm Kara Ocampo, and we're out.